Okay, class, this is our first video on the skeletal muscles. So make sure you have your muscle system lecture notes out in front of you. We'll be following along with that. And there's a table at the end that you're going to need to fill out. So make sure you have that in front of you. Let's get started. Just for a review, remember your 4 tissue types. Epithelial tissue, done that. Connective tissue, done that. Now we're on muscle tissue. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, that's what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. We're talking about the muscles that move our skeleton. Those are voluntary. You have control over those. The other type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. Obviously, that is your heart. Your heart is basically a muscle. You don't really have control over that. And smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is also involuntary, just like cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle is found in your blood vessels. We talked about vasoconstriction, vasodilation. It's found in the tubes in your gut when it's moving food through your intestines. That is all being propelled by smooth muscle. But again, these are involuntary, and we're only talking about skeletal muscle for now. So the characteristic of muscle tissue, it's excitable. What does it mean it's excitable? Muscle tissue is sensitive to stimuli from nerve impulses. What does that mean? So here this is where we're going to have a nerve impulse coming down somewhere from your central nervous system. Your brain is going to send signals out, and it's going to send it down through this thing called an axon, and you'll see this shortly. So if you're in physio, or if you've taken physio, you know there's an action potential coming down this axon. What you need to know, there is electrical stimulation coming down, and it's going to be sending it to our muscle tissue. And muscle tissue, it has receptors for this electrical stimulation coming down, and it's going to respond to that electrical stimulation. If you did not have those nerve impulses coming down to the muscle tissue, it would just be like a dead piece of meat. It would not move. So, contractibility. Once it responds to the stimuli, it's going to contract. And it's going to contract lengthwise, I'll show you that shortly, by shortening the muscle cells, and it's going to produce movement. Extensibility. These two are pretty easy. Excitability, it gets excited by the nervous system, and it responds to that excitement by contracting. Extensibility. This is going to be a little bit harder to understand. The ability of muscle tissue to continue contracting over a range of, quote, resting lengths. What the heck does that mean? So here we have you standing upright. So this is your vertebral column. Basically, you're in the neutral position. If you bend over a little bit, so say you bend over just a little bit, the muscles on your back that are contracting to hold you up in this position, and say you're in this position for a while, this is your new resting length. But those muscles have to continue to contract to hold you up. This is your new resting length. If you bend over even farther, so now the muscles have to, if you bend over and stay in this position, the muscles now back here have to contract again at a new resting length to hold you up. If these muscles did not contract to hold you up, gravity would just have you fall down. So gravity is always in play. So the muscles to hold you up are continuing to contract, even keeping you upright in this neutral position. Those back muscles have to contract to hold you up. So extensibility, the ability of muscle tissue to continue to contract no matter what resting length it is in. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, ask me. We'll go through it again. Elasticity. So when you hear this characteristic, think of an elastic rubber band, a big elastic rubber band. The ability of a muscle after being stretched to recoil back to its original resting length. So if you have a rubber band and you stretch it out and then you let it go, it's going to recoil. It's going to recoil back to its original resting length. Think of that as your muscles doing that also. You are stretching them when you're bending over, and then once you go back to your original resting length, it's going to recoil. These are the two that are going to get you messed up. Extensibility, elasticity. So make sure you have those in your head on what the difference is. You can be guaranteed you're going to be asked about these on an exam. So the functions of skeletal muscle tissue. Number one, movement. When a muscle contracts, it's going to pull on tendons and move the bones of the skeleton. Remember, what's a tendon? Tendons connect muscles to bones. So muscle is connected to this bone here. This is the radius. When that muscle contracts, it's going to pull on the radius and it's going to cause movement. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Heat production. You don't think about that, but your body is made up of 40% of your body weight is muscle tissue. And muscle tissue is in a continuous state of activity. Even when you're not doing anything, when you're just sitting there, the muscles are in a state of activity. They are generating heat. Cellular metabolism, just for a muscle to have a baseline activity, it is creating heat. The more you exercise, heat production is going to go up. And you've all noticed that if it's cold and you're out running, once you start running, you're going to generate heat. Muscles, when they're using cellular metabolism, that ATP, remember ATP, when ATP is released, you are generating heat with that too. When you're cold and you start shivering, those muscles are contracting real fast. That is to generate heat. Maintain posture. Just for you to sit up in your chair right now, your muscles on your back are pulling up, contracting to keep you upright. They're constantly trying to keep you upright to overcome gravity. And you know when they're not working, if you are in the classroom and you get sleepy and your head nods off, your head will go down because the muscles are no longer contracting. But normally they're in a constant activity to keep you upright. And skeletal muscles support body organs. Think of your abdominal muscles. They are holding in and supporting all those abdominal organs. So make sure you have these written down somewhere on a little card to help you remember these things are important. You will be asked about them, the functions of skeletal muscle tissue. Now, before we get started, some muscle terms. If you see the muscle term MY, and then this is our connecting valve, MYO, that refers to muscle. Example, myocardium. This is muscle tissue of the heart muscle. Another thing, muscle cells are strange. They're not like your typical cells that you think of with one nucleus and kind of square, rounded cells. These are long and cylindrical, and they are multinucleated. This is one muscle cell. We don't call them muscle cells. We call them muscle fibers because they are so long and cylindrical. So whenever you hear a muscle fiber, the term muscle fiber, we are talking about a muscle cell. Now these muscle fibers can be short or they can be extremely long. So here's showing you electron microscope view of muscle fibers. These are muscle fibers. These are long and cylindrical, and they are all binded together by this stuff, which is their connective tissue that's holding them together. And that's what we're going to talk about next, the connective tissue of muscle tissue. So, number one, a skeletal muscle, when you say like the biceps brachii, that is a single muscle. It has a name. Skeletal muscles are organs. And they consist of muscle fibers that are connected by connective tissue. You need to know the connective tissue of muscles. So this is a drawing of a cross-section of a muscle. So let's just assume here's a muscle. This is your biceps brachii, and you'll be learning this muscle. But let's say we did a cut through the muscle right here, and we are now seeing a cross section of this cut muscle. And here's the tendon here. Here's the tendon here. So a cross section of a muscle. So here is these little round dots. These are going to be the cross section view of our muscle fibers. Here is the long section of our muscle fibers. Remember, our muscle fibers are long. So here, cross section, muscle fibers. In between our individual muscle fibers is going to be the connective tissue called endomysium. My means muscle, mysium. This is the connective tissue that binds individual muscle fibers together. Endomysium, in between the muscle fibers. It's actually a realer connective tissue, a loose connective tissue in here. The next connective tissue is going to be peri. a connective tissue, perimysium, a connective tissue that binds groups of muscle fibers together into bundles called fascicles. So now this is representing perimysium. Peri means around, and we are going to bind these individual muscle fibers together to form a bundle called a fascicle. So this whole thing is called a fascicle. Peri means around our individual muscle fibers. This is a little bit stronger connective tissue. So this cross-section is showing you how many fascicles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have 7 fascicles in here. Remember, fascicles are formed by our perimysium connective tissue. Then we are going to wrap all these fascicles with a much stronger connective tissue called epimysium. Epi means on top of. Epimysium is dense, irregular connective tissue. So the entire muscle is wrapped in epimysium. You need to know these, and you need to understand these. So what would this look like under a microscope? So here we have our cross-section of our muscle. Here is showing you a cross-section of skeletal muscle. These are the individual muscle fibers, these pink things. In between the individual muscle fibers is going to be what kind of connective tissue? What is this connective tissue in between our muscle fibers? This is endomysium. So this is all endomysium. Then we are going to wrap those individual muscle fibers into another type of connective tissue called what? Perimysium. So this is perimysium. This perimysium is wrapping these individual muscle fibers into groupings, bundles called what? Fascicles. So make sure you're not going to be able to see the epimysium here. Epimysium would be on the outside of the entire muscle. Usually we're not going to be able to see the epimysium on any of our cross sections of our muscle tissue. So endomysium all in through here, perimysium out through here, perimysium out through here, perimysium out through here, making our fascicles. Make sure you can see that. Here is another muscle cross section. Easy to see the muscle fibers. Muscle fibers here. In between the muscle fibers is going to be what kind of connective tissue? What is this connective tissue? This is all endomysium. We are going to wrap our individual muscle fibers with perimysium, and we are going to form a fascicle. Once again, here is one fascicle right here. This is perimysium that is forming this fascicle. These are our individual muscle fibers. You can see the nuclei of the muscle fibers. This is endomysium. Here's a close-up. Here's an individual muscle fiber, the nucleus, and here is the endomysium. Make sure you can See that? Now we're going to look at a longitudinal section of a muscle. So now we're looking at the muscle fibers lengthwise. So this way, this direction. Skeletal muscle longitudinal section. This is, now you can see remember we said muscle fibers where they were multinucleated. You can see the nuclei all throughout each of these muscle fibers. This white stuff is what? What is this white stuff in between the muscle fibers? This is endomysium. The other thing you're going to see skeletal muscle, and you're only going to see it on skeletal muscle that looks like this, is going to be these striations. You can see those striations real well in here. So here again, endomysium. This is one muscle fiber, another muscle fiber, longitudinal section. This was from our classroom. This is a pretty good slide. Here you can see the striations real well. This is one single muscle fiber. Here is the endomysium. And in that endomysium, remember, this is areolar connective tissue. We're going to have lots of blood flow to our muscle tissue and that areolar connective tissue. Over on here, it's showing you the striations, and then you're going, once you go into physio, you're going to learn about Z discs and A bands and I bands and sarcomeres. That is going to be all in physio. That is going to show, in physio, you're going to learn how muscles actually contract. That is going to be physio. So here is a drawing showing you what we just went over. Muscle fiber, aka your muscle cell, long and cylindrical. Individual muscle fibers are joined together by the connective tissue endomysium. We're going to wrap those muscle fibers in the connective tissue called perimysium to form a fascicle. Then we are going to wrap our fascicles together by another connective tissue called epimysium. Epi on top of epimysium is now going to form a muscle. A muscle. So this muscle now has a name. And these connective tissues are going to join the tendons, muscle tendons, and remember that muscle tendon is now connecting into the periosteum of the bone. Got all that? It's not too hard. You just have to figure it out. And when we say the potential power of a muscle, is mostly depends on the number of muscle fibers it contains. The more muscle fibers you have, the more power you potentially have. So when you look at muscle fibers, everybody has basically the same amount of muscle fibers. And there's something called muscle atrophy. This basically means the muscle fibers have shrunk. The size of them has shrunk. If you've ever had a broken leg and then had to be put in a cast, this is what you would see. Here's normal muscle of the lower leg. This person was in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks, unable to use their muscles. the muscle fibers atrophied. So they got to bulk up again, get exercising to build up those muscle fibers again. So atrophy, use it or lose it. Now muscle hypertrophy, now these muscle fibers have been bulked up. It's not like this person has more muscle fibers. He has just strengthened those muscle fibers by exercising them, strengthening them. Hypertrophy, those muscle fibers have been bulked up. And I want you to, next time you go to the store, look at meat. Look at meat in the meat department. You're going to be able to see the muscle fibers. They are easy to see. When you look at the grain of meat, these are muscle fibers. They are running in a certain direction. And that's going to be important when we learn how muscles contract. So this is all a single muscle fibers running down in this direction. Here's a cross section of meat. So you can actually see the connective tissue within this meat, this cross section of meat. So do that. It'll make more sense once you can actually see these muscle fibers. I think we're going to stop here on that one because I really want you to make sure you understand what we went through, get that in your head, make any note cards that you need to, review that video again, make sure you know the characteristics and the functions of muscle tissue and the 3 types of muscle connective tissue.